Welcome to today's webinar, Leapfrog Works Best Practice for Interbedded Lithology Modeling. Please note, the objective of this webinar is to focus on the tools in Leapfrog Works and give you some helpful workflow ideas and tips and tricks to elevate your modeling skills. The material covered in this webinar is meant to be high level, using simplified data sets. I would now like to introduce Gary Johnson, Sequence Customer Solution Specialist and your main technical support resource. Gary is located in our office in Broomfield, Colorado, and has a geology background.
Thank you, Michaela. Today I will be showing you how to use the interval selection tool to model interbedded lithologies. Just to go over a brief rundown of what we're going to be doing in our agenda today, we'll first be doing an explanation of the interval selection tool, why we're going to use it, and how we're going to use it. And then the second one, we're going to explain how to interval borehole data in preparation for modeling the geologic model. And we're going to actually build a 3D geologic model within this 30-minute webinar, and then hold some time for questions at the end. So for those of you who have seen Leapfrog Works before, this is going to be the user interface. And so just a brief rundown of what we have here. On the left, we have the project tree. This is where you're going to be importing your data, working with your data, all with the power of a right click. And then you can see we have our 3D scene here in the middle, where we have our boreholes already loaded in, and you can rotate around in 3D and analyze your boreholes. We then have our shape list here at the bottom, which is going to list any objects that are then within the 3D scene. For this case, we're going to be using the interval selection tool to model interbedded lithologies. Just to give you a little better of a perspective of what we'll be dealing with, I'm going to open up the lithology legend here by clicking on Edit Colors and drag my legend for my lithologies over to the left. I'm then going to turn on the two lithologies in this case, which are interbedded. This is going to be sand and silt, which are interbedded. This is a simplified data set, and so in many cases you might be dealing with more complex interbedded lithologies. You might have transgressive or regressive sequences. But in this case, we just simplified it to sand and silt, and we actually included a fine sand lens in there as well to complicate it a little bit, but to still keep it pretty basic. And so here, if I turn on the sand, you can see that we have two intervals of sand, and if I turn on the silt, you can see we have two intervals of silt. So I'm just going to leave both of these on real quick. Just a little rundown of why we're using the interval selection tool. When you're modeling deposit and erosion surface types in Leapfrog Works, it's going to want to build planar surfaces that are cutting through a single set of borehole intervals. In this case, we have two intervals for the same lithology twice. And so we're not going to know, or the surface type isn't going to know which interval to cut through. So in this case, we're going to split them up into two individual lithologies, sand 1 and sand 2, and silt 1 and silt 2, and then we can easily build deposits or erosions out of those surfaces. It saves a bunch of time, and it's quite an efficient process. And so let's get to it. And so I'm just going to turn all of our lithologies back on, and just to show you real quick what we're dealing with here, we have a sand that is at the top of the surface of our boreholes. We then have a fine sand lens. We then have silt. The sand then repeats itself. We go back to silt, repeating itself, and have a bedrock. One thing to note is that you can see I have cylinders for my boreholes here. Down in the bottom right corner, we have this, it kind of looks like to me like a purple jellyfish or a pink jellyfish, but some people think it looks like a pink or purple mushroom. If you turn that on and off, you can see that it will turn the boreholes from lines, and once it's activated, into cylinders. I think this is great for visualization purposes, and it's definitely good to analyze your boreholes and see them in 3D. So in this project, all we have is a topography and we have borehole data. So that's what we're going to be using to build our geologic model from. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and right-click on my geologic model folder. This will demonstrate the power of a right-click in Leapfrog Works. And I'm going to go ahead and build a new geologic model. One thing to note is that when you're setting up your geologic model, this is the only time that you can assign a base lithology column. This is also the only object in the geologic model that can't go back and be changed. And so one thing to always keep in mind is that you're going to want to set up your base lithology column. I do want to keep in mind we first have to build our intervals, and so we have our intervals here in the, or we have our boreholes in the scene. We want to actually go through and then select those as individual intervals. To do that, you're going to want to expand the borehole data folder, and so we have already imported boreholes, and you're going to want to expand your imported boreholes. In this case, we have only imported a collar file, which is going to be an X, Y, and Z location of the borehole, a borehole identifier or borehole ID, and then also a max depth of your boreholes. And then we also have an interval table, which is going to contain a borehole identifier, and then also to and from intervals, and a lithology or number associated with that. In this case, we have 4 lithologies, might be hidden behind your go-to webinar panel, and those are going to be just the bedrock, fine sand, sand, and silt. In order to create an interval table, or to use the interval selection tool, you're going to want to right-click on your interval table in your boreholes, and you're going to go down to New Column. You're going to see a variety of different tools here. In this case, of course, we're using the interval selection tool, but there's also a few other options. You can group lithologies, you can split lithologies, you can create an overlaid lithology column, or you can import a new column. In this case, we're going to go to that interval selection tool. We're going to select our lithology column that we want to interval, and that's going to be just our base lithology column. And we're going to want to name this interval model 1, as we will be creating an interval model from this data set. An edit window will then appear, which will give you the option to select your intervals and split them or assign them to a new lithology. In order to do this, I'm going to do one lithology at a time, and so I'm going to start with our sand at the top. In order to select your intervals, you can select all visible intervals at once, or you can use the tools to select with the stroke. You can also select individual intervals. When you're using the select intervals with the stroke tool, you'll see that it'll select a width, a designated width of intervals. In order to designate that width, there is this object right to the right of the select intervals with the stroke, and you can change the width of that line that you're going to be selecting with. In this case, I think 30 units or 30 meters is going to be appropriate. Other times you might want to make that much thinner, or you might want to make it thicker depending on the width of your intervals. So I'm going to leave that as the default of 30. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to swipe across my top interval. You will see that this will then highlight all of the intervals, not just in that plane, but in the 3D, so all of the intervals that are behind that plane. And it looks like it has properly highlighted all of the top intervals. We're then going to go down to this Assign To option over here on the interval selection menu and create a new lithology. And so this is going to be our sand 1. One thing that I like to do is I like to keep the colors consistent for visualization purposes so that I don't have 2 separate colors for the same lithology. So I'm going to go ahead and designate this as sand and as yellow, just so that it matches the rest of the boreholes for when we finally build the model. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. I'm going to go ahead then and repeat that for this second interval of boreholes. And so now you can see we have sand 1 designated as its own interval, and I can actually turn that off. And so that makes it easier for me to go through and select my second set of borehole intervals. I can see exactly what is there. I'm going to go back to the select with the stroke option, and I'm just going to swipe across those intervals again. And once again, I'm going to double check, make sure that they are all highlighted, which they are. And I'm going to assign these to a new lithology, create new lithology. I'm going to name this sand 2. Make sure my color is yellow. Go ahead and press OK. Go ahead and press OK. And so now we have the sand built as sand 2 and sand 1, and they're split into 2 separate lithologies. I'm now going to repeat this process for our silt. As you can see, our silt is also in the same orientation. One thing to note is that I'm going to go ahead and use the select intervals with the stroke option again. You can see we have some wider intervals, but as long as I'm able to cut through one of these segments at the top of the intervals, it should highlight all of them all the way back. And so we will double check that. And so just to look around, it looks like we have properly highlighted all of the top intervals. So I'm going to go back to that orientation. And I'm going to assign this to a new lithology, creating a new lithology for silt 1. I'm going to once again change this color to red for visualization purposes. I'm then going to turn off the silt 1 as we have now separated that out. And I'm going to select this second interval again. So repeating the exact same process for the sand, I'm going to once again ensure that all of the boreholes are highlighted in the scene and assign these to a new lithology, and I'm going to name this silt 2. So now we have all of our intervals selected and split into individual lithologies. One thing that you will note is that you can see all of the lithologies that I have created are going to be highlighted. You're actually going to have more control over these lithologies than you do of the identifiers that are imported with your boreholes. If you double click on Bedrock, for example, you'll see you can't edit the name, and you can't delete anything that has previously been imported with the boreholes. If you do click on Sand 1, for example, you do have the option to delete any lithologies that you have added or assigned to within Leapfrog Works. Because the names were previously included with the boreholes themselves, you can't actually delete those or remove those from the legend or list itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn all lithologies back on. And what you do want to make sure you do here is save. Actually created a new lithology column. I'm going to save. It's going to be quick processing over here, and I can actually go in here and exit out of this now. If you expand our interval table, you can now see that we have this intervals model 1 column here. If we double click this, you can see the same interval options that we previously saw. So now what do we do? Now we're going to want to go back and create that new geologic model. And so we now have these intervals. One little tips and tricks, if you right click at the top or right on project tree, you can actually collapse the entire project tree. Nice and keep things organized. I'm going to go ahead now and create that new geologic model by right clicking on the geologic model folder and going to new geologic model. When you're setting up a geologic model, once again, you're going to want to ensure that you designate your base lithology column to the correct column. So we have our interval model 1 column here. I'm going to keep the surface resolution as the default settings, but I am going to enclose the model extents. In this case, I already have a model created that I'm going to actually use the boundary of another model that I have in this program. This is going to be for comparison purposes. And so if you do have 2 models built within the same project, you can always use the boundary of the other model. And this will ensure that your boundaries are correctly within your topography and contained where your data is. In this case, I'm going to name this my interval model for webinar. And I'm going to go ahead and press OK. So once that model has processed, you will see that there's no longer any processes running. We have our task complete. If I now bring that model into the scene, you will see, oops, there we go. We have a bunch of unknown. And so why is this designated as unknown? And if you actually wanted to find out what exactly this lithology is contained in this volume, which is actually gray right now, so it might be kind of difficult to see, you can always click on any object in the scene. It'll tell you exactly what that is. And so if you click here, you can see that this is unknown. It'll give you a location, a volume, and an area. So I'm going to X out of that. We now want to actually build our surfaces in order to designate our output volumes. And so for my best practices of building surfaces, I like to keep my intervals in the scene Might zoom in a little bit. And so I like to look directly west or directly east on my model. And so in order to do that, you always have these look functions here. These are very helpful. And if you can always click on one of these or use the keyboard shortcuts. And so if you ever want to look east on your model, you can just press E on your keyboard. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can now see that we have our boreholes correctly orientated, and we're going to go through and build some surfaces. And so personally, I like to build from the bottom up, and especially when using deposits, I think it's easiest to build from the bottom up. And so the first surface that I will be building will be for that bedrock, which is there at the base down here. And so to build your surfaces, you're going to want to right click on the surface chronology folder. You'll see that there are a variety of different surfaces that we can make. In this case, we're going to be building a deposit. If you are ever using borehole data to build your surfaces from, you're going to want to use the option to build your surface or build your deposit from base lithology. You can see there's also a variety of other options there, and that is because you don't have to have borehole data to build your surfaces from, and you can actually add other data to your surfaces as well. So whichever data source you want to use as a point of truth, you can select here. In this case, we're going to be using our boreholes. And so automatically, it's going to be selecting our primary lithology as bedrock, which is going to be correct. It will be telling us that we're only going to be contacting silt 2 above the bedrock, as we are using contacts above as we're building from bottom to top. And in parentheses, it'll tell you how many times your bedrock is contacting silt 2. And so in this case, we have 44 different contacts. That'll actually correspond because we have 44 boreholes. And so in every single borehole, bedrock is touching silt. I'm going to leave the default options on here and just go ahead and press OK. So we now have a surface built between that bedrock and silt 2 contact. We can now drag that into the scene and see that that surface is also color coded to correspond to the bedrock green on the bottom and silt 2 red on top. And so now what do? We're going to repeat that process for the next surface in our sequence. You might be wondering, why am I using deposits for this surface? When you have a very clear stratigraphy as we have here, deposits are going to be the easiest function to use, especially when you're dealing with sedimentary layers. They're going to correspond to a sedimentary deposit very well. So which surface are we building next? I can always click on the next interval in my borehole to determine that. So we have silt 2. So silt 2 will be our next primary lithology. We're going to go new deposit from base lithology. And for that primary lithology, that is going to be the silt 2. You can see that the silt 2 appears to be contacting the sand. And so here, if we click on that next interval, you can see sand 2, and that is also correct here using contacts above, sand 2. We're just going to go ahead and press OK. And so we're going to build a new surface for that. So as we step up our sequence, we're going to see we now have another surface built that is going to be color coded as well. You can see that this surface has a red on the bottom if we were going to turn this off. And so it'll actually be sandwiching the colors between the two surfaces. And so we got red on top, red on bottom. It's going to be building your volumes color coded for you within those surfaces. What is our next surface that we're going to be building up? We're going to be doing the sand 2 as the primary lithology. So we're going to new deposit from base lithology. We're going to select the sand 2 using contacts above, and we're going to go ahead and press OK. You can now see we have this third surface built. So once again, going to be color coded as it's telling you the silt 1 is above this, which is going to be our next surface. So we're going to once again right click on the surface chronology, building a new deposit from base lithology. This time our primary lithology is going to be silt 1 actually, not silt 2. Silt 2 would be on the bottom. And so we now have the silt 1, which is contacting 2 different lithologies this time, which is going to be fine sand in 16 locations and sand 1 in 28 locations. You can see those locations respond to the number in parentheses. We're going to go ahead and press OK as well for this surface. So we now have our second to last surface built. One thing you might notice right away is that the top surface of this deposit is going to be gray, which is going to correspond to unknown. This is because Leapfrog Works is going to know that it's contacting two separate lithologies on this top surface, and so it cannot designate one color to give to that top surface. It's going to know and pick up where exactly it is contacting which lithologies, and so it's being smart here by designating that as a known and not giving it a color identifier. In this last surface we built, you can see that we used the silt contacts where it's contacting sand and fine sand. The next surface in our sequence is going to be that fine sand lens. So in this case, we're going to build a deposit for the fine sand lens, new deposit from base lithology. The primary lithology is once again going to be fine sand. And you can see it's contacting sand 1 16 times. Just going to go ahead and press OK. And so we now have the fine sand and sand 1 contacts. So we now have to actually build this model. And so one thing you might notice if we drag in, actually, I like to think of this as a nice tips and tricks. If you ever have any like items in the scene, you can always double click on one of them. So in this case, we have 5 different deposit surfaces for the same model. So if you double click on one of them, they will all highlight. And so this is nice if you want to turn them all on or turn them all off at once. In this case, I actually want to clear them from the scene. And so to just clear those objects from the scene, you go ahead and press X. You can also see then that we have inactive listed next to our surfaces. And so one of the nice things about Leapfrog Works is it doesn't activate your surfaces until you actually want to activate them. This is really nice when you want to edit or modify a particular surface, but you don't want to reprocess the entire geologic model. As most of you probably know, Leapfrog Works is dynamically linked, and so any updates to the boreholes or to the surfaces will reprocess the model. This is really nice when you're dealing with, let's say, cross sections and you've made updates to your model, or you've imported new boreholes, for example. Your model will reprocess and take into account the new data or changes that have been made. So in order to activate those different surfaces, we want to double click on the surface chronology folder, or you can actually right click and open. In this case, I'm going to double click. You can see that our surface chronology options will pop up. And I'm going to tick this box to the left of my contact surfaces. One thing to note is that I have also built my surfaces from the bottom to the top, which will automatically put them in the correct age order. If you build them vice versa, you will have to reorder your contacts, and this can be done by highlighting an individual contact and moving it either younger up or older to the bottom. So I like to think of this as almost a strat column right here. In this case, we have a surface designated for every single lithology, and so we don't need to designate a background lithology. I'm going to go ahead and press OK, and that's going to process and build our model. Okay, and so we now have our geologic model here built for the interval model for webinar. So if you just drag the interval model for webinar into the scene, you can see that we now have a geologic model built. And so, of course, we want to check and see if this actually does, is this model corresponding to our boreholes? And so we want to press D on the keyboard, which will look directly down on the model. And then you can go up to the slicing tool right to the right of the mouse and draw a slicer. And so we can actually slice on through the model. I think this is a great way to compare your boreholes and your geologic model. And so I like to set the opacity of my interval model down a little bit so we can see through and see those boreholes through the model. And so hopefully you can all see this very well. Another cool thing that you can do in Leapfrog Works is actually use the greater than, less than symbols on your key, or the period and the comma, to then shift through your slicer. One thing to note is that this slicing tool will be listed down here in the shape list, and you can actually control the step size. So in this case, we're only stepping through 10 units every time I click one of those objects. You can step through that using the greater than, less than symbols and compare your model output volumes to your boreholes. See how well they correspond. In this case, it looks pretty good. You can also drag the slicer around using control and a right click. And this is a little bit of a smoother process. So you don't have to click any buttons. And so we now have our model built. So we have used the interval selection tool to split this into individual intervals. And so just to show you real quick, if I click on my top surface, you see we have our sand 1. You can then see our fine sand lens is modeled correctly there as that fine sand in the blue. And then we have our silt 1, sand 2, silt 2, and our bedrock. And so this is going to be the endpoint of this webinar. I would like to open this up to questions. And so we're going to hop into the questions tab. And so if you have any questions, if you could please submit them into the questions tab on the webinar, we'd be happy to answer as many as we can get to.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. Let's take a look at the questions that we have got submitted during today's session. The first question comes in from Andrew. Andrew asks, how would you set the correct age order of lithologies in Leapfrog?
It's a great question. And so I'm going to hop back into Leapfrog Works to demo some of these question answers real quick. When you first set up your surface chronology, one of the things you'll notice, and one of the things that I pointed out, is that there's going to be this younger, older than symbol. And depending on the order in which you made your lithologies, that order will be assigned. And so if you build from bottom to top, that order will automatically be in older to younger. And if you build your surface chronologies from bottom or from top to bottom, you're going to have to reorder those. One thing to keep in mind is that when you have deposits or clear sedimentary deposits, you're going to know which object is older and younger, and you're going to want to assign that properly. When you are dealing with a vein, for example, or an intrusion, Leapfrog Works is actually quite geologically smart in many ways. And so it's going to know that if you have a vein that cuts through your deposits, that is going to be the youngest object there. And so you're going to actually want to order your deposits first and leave the vein or the intrusion which cut through those as the younger surfaces. And so that's why I like to think of this object here as a strat column, as it's going to be telling you, and you're going to be designating what is going to be the older and younger lithologies.
Great. All right, we've got another question coming in from Rebecca. Rebecca asks, why would you choose the interval selection versus the split lithology tool?
So this is a really good question. And in this case, I actually could have used the split lithologies tool just to show you what the split lithologies tool is real quick, or where it is. So if you want to expand the borehole data folder and your imported boreholes, if you right click on your interval table and go down to new column, you will see that right above the interval selection tool is the split lithologies tool. Split lithologies tool will only let you separate intervals between one single lithology. So in this case, I actually could have used the split lithologies tool. One thing that I like about the interval selection tool is that it gives you more room for interpretation. And so you can actually group things that aren't within the same lithology. And this might be more applicable to your guys' workflow, something that would be more aligned with what you might be doing. And especially depending on the different import, I guess, names that you have, you might be grouping different sand layers together or intervaling them together. The actual selection process, so selecting with the stroke, is going to be the same for split lithologies and the interval selection tools. But I just wanted to demo the interval selection as it might be more applicable to things that you'd want to do.
Okay, another question coming in from Zach. What if you want to join sedimentary lenses of the same lithology?
This is a great question. A lot of the time you might have lenses that are interconnected and or terminating against each other. You might have complex lens systems. The best way to model this, in my opinion, is going to be as a vein system. Vein systems are really cool. They actually allow you to assign interactions. In order to build a vein system, it is actually going to be a surface type. So you're going to want to right click on the surface chronology folder and go down to new vein system. It's going to create a vein system. In this case, let's just say we have that fine sand, and the outside lithology is unknown because it's going to be multiple lithologies. You'll see that a new surface type is going to come up, and that's going to be a new vein system. If I right click, you can see you have the option to then build a new veins within the vein system itself. You can also then open this up, and there's this tab here called the vein system tab. And so if you did have veins selected or already built within the vein system, you can select vein priorities, and you can then assign interactions. Interactions are pretty cool when dealing with veins, and you can assign terminations, and so allow different veins to terminate against each other, but this can be very applicable to sedimentary lenses.
Thank you, Gary. We're coming up to the full time for our webinar. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Leapfrog Works Best Practice for Interbedded Lithology Modeling. If you have any other questions, please contact our technical support team at support.civil@sequent.com. On behalf of Sequent, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.